G'day everyone. My name's Dom from Hivello, one of the co-founders, and obviously I've got a prezzo. But maybe just to start, in terms of DePIN, how many people here sort of know that DePIN's been around for about 40 years as a concept? You know, a couple. So maybe just to give you a little bit of background and history, the first DePIN was about 40 years ago, pioneered by NASA and a research group called SETI. And so NASA was basically generating all this content from satellites and other radio telescopes, and they didn't have the computing power in order to process all the data. And then they set up a research lab called SETI to try and come up with a solution of how do we actually solve this problem of a lot of data and not enough compute. And so some of you who are maybe old enough would remember an application that you downloaded onto your computer called SETI. And so every day it would download a bunch of data. It would basically process that data and then send it back to SETI, or basically NASA. And back then, pre-blockchain, there was obviously no blockchain or tokens in terms of incentivization. And if you found a star or a planet, you could basically name that star or planet. So there was a reward mechanism still built in to that. But what I'm going to cover is obviously some DePIN history, which I've kind of just gone over. I'm going to bit of an overview on Havello, and we just TG'd last week. How many people here are going to TG sometime this year? A few people? Okay. So I've got some TG learnings for those that are looking at going through it, and then tell you about our airdrop. I've kind of already mentioned SETI. I don't need to go through those particular slides, but really interesting. This was kind of like a volunteer network, and so it was really the first concept of decentralized compute, which is really quite amazing back in the 90s. And obviously after 20 years, and actually only stopped doing it very recently. So because obviously compute power has changed in a very material way. I guess just to maybe sort of jump into Havello, our whole vision is really about trying to make DePIN accessible to the mass market. What we know is that DePIN is inherently complicated, and our view is for DePIN to become mass market, at least on the supply side, it needs to be as easy as using Spotify or iTunes. And just, I guess, in terms of a little bit of background, two of the co-founders, myself and Andrew, our prior company that we founded was a company called Banksa, which is one of the leading fiat on and off ramps, in fact, second behind MoonPay in terms of transaction volume. And we learned a lot through the process of making on-ramping. This basically started out in 2014, making on-ramping super easy, because back then it's already hard to onboard, but it was even harder back 10 or so years ago. And so with Banksa, we pioneered that process, and the company still exists, and we listed it on the stock exchange a couple of years ago. And our view of, we're obviously big believers. So from Banksa, building infrastructure that connected the fiat to the digital asset world, we move on to Havello. We saw significant opportunity in DePIN, but we also saw there were a number of challenges, and challenges around, for example, there are hundreds of DePINs. There are new ones coming out all the time. So being able to keep up. Second of all, many DePINs require staking of their native token, as well as having the gas on from the L1 that they're working on. So that also brings up a level of complexity as well. And there's really a time to learn and earn. And so our view was there's got to be a better way. And so we built a platform. We launched it about 3 months ago. We've done basically a little bit of marketing on X, but not a lot of marketing. We are just under 30,000 nodes running. We're up, I think, about 80% in the last 30 days. So people are really just starting to lap up the opportunity for Havello. And the whole process is it's aggregation and orchestration, allowing customers to run multiple DePINs at the same time. And so you download the software, it works out your system configuration, your RAM, CPU, your GPU, and then it will install the best DePINs to maximize the ROI. And then over time, using an AI agent, it will optimize, personalize the DePINs that are running on your specific machine. And then most importantly is, how do you get paid? We give customers an option to get paid in the native DePIN tokens that they're mining, the Havello token, stablecoin, or cash, or a combination of all the above. And so we're able to appeal to both Web 2 and Web 3 users. And I come back to my point earlier. I think one of the big opportunities and challenges for everyone in Web 3 is that we talk a lot of sort of techno geek, and I'll put up my hand and say I'm guilty as charged because I'm a nerd, so I love technology. But yes, power to the geeks. But for most people out there, they don't care. They don't care about the car getting from A to B. They just want to go from A to B. They don't care that it's a 6-cylinder or electric or whatever the details are behind the scenes. And sometimes, I guess, as an industry, we get caught up in that detail. And the apps is literally download, install, plug in your wallet details and start earning. It is basically that simple. And the reason we can make that super simple is because we're orchestrating, if I sort of go back, we're orchestrating a multitude of Web3 processes behind the scenes. So generating and managing public and private keys, swapping tokens, paying gas, staking. And in my view, once again, I believe one of the big opportunities for all the Web3 companies is, how do you create something that is as simple as using Spotify or iTunes or just any kind of Web2 app. So in terms of what we're looking for, we're here in Hong Kong. Our company is domiciled out of Europe as well as Asia and Australasia. What we're looking for is working with more DePINs. We've got a whole list of DePINs that we're in the process of integrating. So if you run a DePIN, we'd love to talk to you. At the same time, working with distribution partners on a revenue share. We're working with a number of exchanges, some wallets, and many other groups from a distribution perspective. And obviously our tokens live as well on Gate and MEXC and on Radium. So that's kind of let's call it on the Havello front. And I was actually talking to a couple of projects earlier today, and they said, we'd love to actually hear your experience when it comes to TGing a company, basically listing your token on various exchanges. And what I'll do, I'm not going to mention any names. So there's no juiciness in regards to different names, but I'll just talk conceptually around, what went right for us and what didn't go right, and what I would advise other founders, co-founders, and companies that are looking to TGE. And the first of all is, part of any TGE strategy is making sure that you get listed on centralized exchanges. I think, DEXs are great, but for the mass market, having centralized exchanges, I think, is super important. And our key learning there is, and if the project is able to pay in cash, i.e. in USDT, and not in the native token, that's better, because what most exchanges will do is that they'll take the token that you paid them and just basically dump it on the market, which is not beneficial to anyone. And unfortunately, we saw this firsthand. Second of all, I'm a big believer of launchpads, but the general feedback that I've had from launchpads is they are a great marketing vehicle, a way to build the community, but it's not about raising money. So don't expect that a launchpad will raise you money, because usually they don't, but they will get your name out there for a cost. And then market makers, and this is going to be a pretty controversial comment. There are many market makers out there, and frankly, they're all pretty much the same. They do the same thing. They've got bots behind the scenes, people that manage the bots manage the trading. But there's really two key types of market makers. There's the retainer model, where you pay them a fee to make the market. And then there's the token lend model, where you lend them tokens and then they will basically trade. And what I'm going to say is controversial, and they're going to hate me for it, is if you can afford it, and frankly, if you're going to TG, you need to be able to afford it, go for the retainer model, because in the other token lend model, you can end up getting screwed. Excuse my language. So hopefully there's a few little tidbits there for those that are looking to TGE. I'm looking at a couple of people. We're looking at actually going to run an AMA or podcast on this, because I think founders and co-founders of companies need to hear this stuff. No one's talking about it. And my view is we want to build a community. We want people to grow. And frankly, it's better for investors if companies are going to TGE sort of follow those few practices. So in terms of how to get in touch, Telegram, follow Hivello on Twitter or on X these days. We're actually got an airdrop coming mid-March. And so the way that basically works is you download the Havello application, you start mining, you earn points on a daily basis, and then those points will get converted into an airdrop. And obviously, the earlier you are, the more airdrops you get. The standard process in any DePIN, it's really the whole notion of cold start. So I definitely encourage people to get out there and start using Havello. Love to take any questions. That just raise your hand and basically yell out a question if you got one.
How's your token price doing?
Token price from TGs are down about 30%. Which is not bad in terms of the market from last week, but just to kind of illustrate that point, when we listed, we were up 50% in the first 5 minutes, and then one of the exchanges basically sold all of the tokens and went down to down 70%, and now it's back up sort of 30% below TGE. So it was basically once again, the key learning coming from that. I think everything's a learning experience. And now for us, the most important thing is just grow the community, grow the user base. I think we're up over 500% from December in terms of our node growth, and for me, that will ultimately drive the performance in the token price and the business. And it's a bit like banks are. In the early days, it was it took a long time for us to build momentum and build the business. But banks are, as a public company, anyone can go and have a look at the financials. We're doing billions of dollars of transaction volume, working with all the major exchanges and wallets. And so my view is we're still at the early stages. I'm only interested in building a long-term sustainable business. Banks was one, Havello will be another. But thank you for your question, sir. Go.
Hi. So I couldn't get from the presentation, what kind of DePIN suppliers are you looking for? Is it just for validators, or is it for normal services, basically hosting or something like that?
In terms of DePINs that we're looking for, DePINs that can run on standard desktops, laptops, on Windows, Mac, or Linux. And so the oldest machine we've got, I think, is a 12-year-old Mac. It just needs to run the latest OS, and Windows 10, we've got 10-year-old machines, all up to brand new machines with, high-class, high-performance GPUs. And so if you've got a really old 10-year-old machine, and, there are tens of millions of machines out there that are basically, in a cupboard in the bottom drawer, people can basically spark them up and actually start earning the native DePIN tokens, as well as the Havello token, and earn points. And obviously,
how about on the other side, on the client side, who uses these machines? Is it used for hosting or for service providing, or CPUs, GPUs?
Yeah, so just to give everyone a bit of a sense of maybe the DePIN space. So you've typically got the DePIN themselves, and then there's really two parts, two kind of streams that I see. There's what I call the demand stream. And so the demand are companies, organizations wanting to use the services of this DePIN, whether it's storage, their IP address, their bandwidth, their GPU, their CPU. And that's usually the domain of the DePIN, to go out there and actually get the business. I've got some ideas around that. And then conversely, on the other side, you have what is called the supply side, which is the millions of computers around the world that are basically contributing to the decentralized network. And so my view is, if you ask me, what comes first, the chicken or the egg? My answer will be the egg comes first, and the egg is the supply side. We as a DePIN industry need to build out the supply side to basically make sense on the demand side for companies to be able to use much more resilient networks, networks that are deeper than where they are today. And the reason you ask, why did I get from Banxa into this? Going back into DePIN or going into DePIN for me was just a real natural progression, and that is when the internet started and when it started becoming popular in the mid-90s. When I built a website, I hosted it on my machine at home or at the office. Things were so much more decentralized, and then in Web 2, things became much more centralized. And I think Web 3 is going back to the ethos of all things decentralization, and that's why I'm a big advocate. And so, sorry, you got to.
So for the demand side, so right now you just focus on the supply and the demand side comes later, or you already also took a steps for the demand side?
We're not focused on the demand side. Is the domain of the DePIN. They're going out there and getting the companies. I mean, I've got some thoughts. Thinking forward is building sort of an API that covers all the DePINs and just letting people connect into the API without getting too nerdy. But that's the next step. The first step is just focus on building out that supply side, have millions of computers around the world, and being able to have millions of people around the world be their own boss, being able to actually generate income. We've had huge growth in emerging markets because, $20 or $30 a month may not be much for people in Hong Kong because things are super expensive, or me in Europe or Australia. But if you're in emerging markets, $20 or $30 actually can make a difference. And if you've got a really strong GPU, you could be earning $200 or $300 a month. So there actually is money to be made in this particular space, but it's super early. And I think we've got time for one more question, one or two.
Yes, we have time.
Hi, I'm Mike from the network. We are like VC syndicate, and I'd like to go back a little bit to what you said about market makers and launchpads and everything. I agree that I think more founders should talk about mistakes and go-to-market journeys. So I'd like to elaborate on this, and maybe you can share some things you would do differently on your go-to-market strategy, or maybe you can share some things that you spend money on that actually don't work at all.
Yeah, good point. I think, as I sort of touched on a couple of slides before, I said, exchanges. I think listing on centralized exchanges are an important part of the TGE journey. And my biggest advice to companies that are looking to TGE is if you can afford it, this is all predicated on the fact that you've got enough USDT sitting in your wallets, just pay the exchanges with cash, and that's the end. And if I look at, and once again, I'm not going to mention any names because I'm just not going to do so, but if I look at the exchange that we paid cash to, there was net buying on day number one. The exchange that we paid tokens to, there was net selling on day one. So it doesn't take a genius to work out, basically what went on there. So that was really one of the first learnings. And we've got a whole series. In fact, the next exchange we list on will be Bitpanda, which is really big in the European market. And we've got a steady stream of other exchanges over the next 12 months. And I will be following my own advice, paying cash, because that's just better for everyone, including the investors. Second of all, when it comes to launch pads, we basically launched, we were oversubscribed on multiple launch pads, but there's a little sort of, I won't say a trick, it's like a little nuance with launch pads. They all have a 24-hour refund window or a 3-day refund window.
Yeah.
Okay. So that's the business model that they operate. And so if, once again, you learn this from experience. Our launchpad round was 25% of TGE, which means the investor gets 25% of their tokens on day one, 1 month lock, 5 month linear vesting. So it's pretty vanilla. And that, once again, the general feedback there was, unless the token gets 4x in the 24 hours, you will basically get a bunch of refunds because those investors on launchpads are typically only looking for a quick win. Can I take that 25% of TGE, which is 25% of my investment, sell it, take back my principal, and then the rest is profit. So in my view, the incentivization or alignment between launchpads and companies, DePIN companies, other companies in the space is not there. There's actually a misalignment.
Yeah.
But what I will say with launchpads, they exposed us to hundreds of thousands of new users who ended up coming in and actually just buying the token outside of that, because we could actually do some tracking with regards to the wallets. And then in terms of, I think people in marketing here are going to hate me for saying this, but I would say that 50% of the marketing spend was basically a waste of time and money. And the issue is, like in a lot of marketing, is not knowing what 50% was basically a waste or not. And so if we had our time again, I would make sure that I had very specific tracking on every single influencer campaign and basically track that back to ROI. That would have been, but we were like rushing, going hard in terms of TG and all those kinds of things. And so sometimes you just think, okay, we'll just go out there and hopefully it all works. And so I would say some of the KOLs and marketing that we did work really well. Some of it didn't work so well. And now we've implemented a system. Any marketing we do has to have a specific URL that we then internally do a quick ROI. Has it worked? Does it cost us money? Is it neutral, or has it made us money? And so once again, another key learning. And I think with Daniel at Hotspotty and the guys there, I think we're going to run an AMA on this, because we've had so much feedback from projects saying, tell us this stuff before we actually list. Tell us this stuff as we go in terms of building the business. And I think this is just, interesting for anyone who's running a company, whether you're Web3 or not.
Yeah. So what was the traction when you went for the listing? Like, how many users were required, right? So
yeah. So we, when we listed, I think we were at maybe 15,000 nodes. 18, I think it was just before listing, 18,000 nodes. And in the last week, we've had over 10,000 nodes generated. And I will say, and there was some key learnings there, because I think, life is always key learnings, and you can either bullshit to yourself and say, it's all fine. But the way I prefer, I got a little saying that feedback is the breakfast of champions. And I'm, my hardest critic. So when a mistake gets made, I want to learn from it. So, but what I will say is one of the biggest concepts and opportunities with DePIN is this concept of a cold start. And so you're trying to build infrastructure or trying to build a network, and you can use your token as a way of incentivizing and growing the community, incentivizing the community. And that, I would say, if you're asking me what went well or what would I do again, absolutely, I'd basically be listing the token. I would have made some of those small changes around the exchanges and the launch pads and those things. But absolutely, I will do it, because I can see people, they're buying the token, they're staking it for a yield, they're using the Havello platform and staking it and getting a high percentage of the rewards, creating a whole flywheel effect with the token. So I think if the token and the tokenomics and the incentivization around that is built well, the tokens have a way of accelerating the growth of the company, in a way that you cannot do in the traditional world. So I think, I didn't come up with the whole notion of tokens and cold start. I think Helium and some of the other groups did it multiple years ago, but that's the benefit, I believe, and that I wouldn't change at all in terms of us listing our token.
I think thank you so much. I think we run out of
Thank you,
time.
everyone.